I'm Mary Wallace, and I serve as the Assistant Vice President for Student Experience at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. And along with my colleague, La'Tonya Rease Miles, who wrote a chapter in the book, First Gen Professionals in Higher Education. We were, LT was connected with Lear's group, and we began to develop a series called First Gen Professionals as Influencers. And the thought was that there is still so much deficit language with first gen students. Some of that was translating into the first gen professional conversations that we were having. And we thought, you know what, let's put a pin in that and really understand the influence that first gen professionals have in the workforce, and began to think about the things that we could do to pull first gen professionals together to talk about some of these topics. One of the topics that continues to be big in conversations at conferences or on webinars or things that LT and I have been doing together is the topic of imposter syndrome, and sort of how that impacts first gen professionals, but also how do first gen professionals sort of turn imposter syndrome on its head and just embrace who we are and what we bring uniquely to the table. And so LT immediately thought of Dr. Tom Dickson, who is with us tonight. And Tom has an incredible bio. I'm going to let Tom talk about who he is and what he's done. The big thing for me to know is that Tom is first gen and is a first gen professional, a first gen student, and has worked tirelessly in his career to impact our first gen students, mostly between Arizona and California. And so I want to turn the mic over to Tom and get us started.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, entirely between Arizona and California. I've grown up in the Southwest. I was raised in the Southwest, went to college in the Southwest, and I've worked in the Southwest. But most of my experience has been in higher education. I worked for Arizona State University in a variety of advising positions, advising administrative positions. I worked at University of Arizona for a little while, for about 6 years as the assistant dean for the College of Nursing, running their student affairs programs. Came over to University of California, Riverside. I was the assistant vice provost for undergraduate education, where I ran things like health professions advising, undergraduate research, high impact practice programs, student experiential learning type programs, internships. And that's also where I developed the first UCR's first gen initiatives to help support first gen students. It's also how I got connected with La'Tonya Rease Miles with the UC First Gen Coalition. I've been doing a lot of work with first gen students and supporting first gen students for many years. I now have transitioned. I'm just about celebrating my 1 year anniversary with a group known as GIA. It's Growing Inland Achievement. The region I live in Southern California, is actually known as the Inland Empire. We are the area kind of about 45 miles inland from Los Angeles, and it's all of San Bernardino and Riverside counties. It's a huge regional area that basically goes everywhere from Riverside all the way to the Arizona border. It's a massive space. If by land mass alone you were looking at it, it would be the 26th largest state in the United States. And we have a huge population in a variety of clustered areas, and 19 institutions in the region, community colleges and universities, and some private 4-years. And my job at Growing Inland Achievement is supporting all of those post-secondary institutions. So I help them with institutional transformation. So anything that helps those campuses better support our students and help get more students through college. So that said, for me, a lot of my background has been in having conversations with professionals, advisors. I started off in advising, talking to a lot of advisors about all of the other duties as assigned and some of the struggles that they would come up with. In fact, that's what I wrote my dissertation on. My bachelor's and master's degree were psychology and counseling, and my doctorate was higher education administration. I wrote my dissertation on the other duties as assigned of academic advising. Was looking at all of the job duties that advisors did that were outside the norm of what advisors were supposed to do or what had been originally founded in research. But a lot of that came up with just advisors not feeling like they had a good sense of their work. There wasn't clarity. They were uncertain or unsure, and being kind of forced to expand their scope of work so that they could be utilized to do more things than just what advisors had historically been forced to do. And so I studied a lot about that, studied a lot about burnout as a result of that. And some of that gave me some time to do some personal introspection. And it got me to this idea of imposter syndrome, or what's also known as imposter phenomenon. It was something that I had always felt as a first gen student, as a student who was low income by the time I got to college. The official definition is a feeling of phoniness in people who believe they're not intelligent, capable, or creative, despite evidence of high achievement. The original coiners of the term were therapists working with high achieving career women and executives in the 1970s, late 1970s. And they were noticing kind of this pervasive feeling that folks believe they were not intelligent, capable, or creative, despite the fact that they were executives. That's really ringing true for me quite heavily. I had noticed that I felt very much this way all throughout my career. And I'll say a quick little brief about that so you can know more about how I got there. But I was born and raised in Phoenix, Arizona, kind of a middle-class neighborhood, middle-class family. And college was always expected. That was just an expectation. I was going to college. You belonged in college. You're going to college. About junior high, my dad became a rampant alcoholic, and he blew through every penny the family had. Parents divorced. But the narrative switched very quickly from one of you're automatically accepted, you automatically belong, like go to college, it's a guarantee. The narrative switched over to one that was you have to find a way to earn your way in. You have to find a way to get a scholarship because that's the only way we can afford for you to go to college. You were no longer I was no longer automatically accepted. I was no longer kind of automatically belonging in that environment. And as a white middle class kid who had been told you're automatically accepted, like that was a culture shock for me. And so by the time I did get to college, I definitely had this feeling that I wasn't quite good enough. I'd moved from being a big fish in a small pond to being at best a medium fish in a gigantic ocean. And college just kind of reinforced this idea that I wasn't automatically belonging and that I had to constantly prove myself. And that's what you often hear from a lot of folks with imposter syndrome. Can't internalize success. You can't accept success. Success is dismissed as luck. You want to belong, but often you feel like a fraud. You feel like you're going to get found out at any moment, that you don't deserve success, that you're going to fake it till you make it. And honestly, I would love to say that this is something that should just be explained by this term imposter syndrome or imposter phenomenon. But as much as I use those terms, I also want to throw them out the window because so much of that is rooted in different types of systemic oppression, racism, all sorts of different issues, ableism, that have been generated that help make people not be included. It was environments not built for them. And so it's college is a peak time for this, and you know that's it's a time where it kicked in for me. I kicked in that kicked in for me in college, but it also kept going for me into my professional career. As I started early on, I had earned my bachelor's and my master's really fast. I was starting off in some supervisory positions very quickly early in my career, and I'm supervising people who are 30 and 40 years my senior. Uh, I'm supervising people who have 20, 30 years of advising experience, and I have 3. You know, but I had a master's degree and they didn't, and that is what you needed to move up. And so that kept going, and you know, every time I got into a new position, I was always in this mindset that, you know, at any moment they're going to find out that I really don't know anything, and that I really am not good, and that I really shouldn't be here. But you know, even after 20, what was it, 20 through 22, 23 years in higher education, working in different positions, that feeling never went away. Um, some people have it short term, some people have it for specific time periods, some people have it all the time. For me, it never went away. I still have it now. It's a little less in this environment, working with a regional nonprofit, than it has been working in higher ed. Higher ed definitely exacerbated these feelings, and I can always talk more about that later. Uh, but I would love to hear from other folks, like, is any of this ringing true? Is this things that you've heard or felt in your experiences? I know we've got some other folks on with us.
Yeah.
Is anybody willing to?
We had Jessica join. Lane, are you with us?
Hey,
I don't know if
I'm driving, so I
Lane,
have
I know
myself
Lane is
muted.
signed on, but I hadn't heard yet from her. There she is.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me. I'm enjoying listening so far.
Got it. Okay. Thanks, Lane. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I think how have you experienced sort of what Dr. Dickson is thinking about and has experienced? And I'd love to hear from others too. If I need to start, I can, because I got a whole bucket of imposter syndrome.
And for all of this, you can just call me Tom. Yeah, let's hear some of your experience, Mary.
Yeah, so let's start with the moment I find out that the first master's degree class I'm in, what student affairs really is. I had joined the master's degree program because of some personal reasons, but I didn't really understand it. And once I figured out what it was, I thought, oh my gosh, am I really meant to be here? You know, if I didn't know what this was, am I really meant to be here? And then, you know, just to present day, even transitioning from being a director to an assistant vice president, am I doing the assistant vice president thing right? I must be missing something. Just all sorts of things with kind of moving up. And I think we talk a little bit about that in the First Gen Professionals book, the idea of, as you're transitioning to each level of your career, the imposter syndrome just sort of boots up a little bit more. And I've definitely experienced that in the assistant vice president role for sure.
I'll jump in. I similar to Mary, I think there's, you know, different points where you move around in your career, where I've experienced it. You know, certainly, I'm originally from the Midwest, so moving to the South and feeling, you know, moving into the role of the assistant vice president and feeling like, okay, this is where I belong, this is where I should be, this is where I can contribute. I've also served in some roles within my professional associations, and just feeling like, okay, I was the right person that was elected in those positions, and that I was the person that was supposed to be serving there, but just constantly questioning yourself on, am I doing the right thing? Am I making sure that I'm covering the right items with everyone? And am I leading in the appropriate way? Are people expecting different things from me than what I'm delivering? I think those are always things that we question ourselves on.
Absolutely.
Tom, does the literature say anything about like gender differences with imposter syndrome or that sort of thing?
Yeah, it definitely does. So the original authors, Clance and Imes, that coined the term imposter phenomenon, um, they were studying female CEOs and the female executives during the late 1970s, and that was where they had seen this trend happening over and over and over again. And as you can imagine, late 1970s business world was probably not exactly the most female friendly environment.
Probably not.
We know it wasn't. And we know that throughout history there's been other unfriendly environments, and that we still exist in an unfriendly environment for a variety of people from a variety of backgrounds and identities. And what they had found very quickly was that while were focusing on women, they started immediately finding this same thing in men. They were finding the same thing in different ethnicities. They were finding this in different cultural groups, different employment levels. They were finding this at all levels of folks that they were working with. And I'm not surprised. The term imposter syndrome and imposter phenomenon took off quite aggressively, but really did not get a lot of attention, and probably until about the last 10 to 15 years. Not sure exactly what it was that kicked things off and made folks kind of retake up this thing that had been around since the late 70s as a term. But the idea that it was the late 70s is also, I think, mostly just because of when the term was coined. Just because you named a thing at that moment doesn't mean that it wasn't a thing before. I was thinking about my psychology background. I was thinking about Alfred Adler, who was a psychologist in the 1920s, and he described a thing that was very much the same as this, called the inferiority complex. And the inferiority complex was this idea of universally having this feeling that we're incomplete, that we don't know something, and that we're dependent upon others. And this idea was born of this idea that we're born into the world dependent upon others for our everything, for our entire survival. And that as you're transitioning into adulthood, that responsibility for your own everything becomes your own. You have to transition from dependent to independent. We talk about this a lot with students, undergraduates. You're still kind of being supervised, and then by the time you get into graduate school, the idea is that you're going to be an independent researcher. College is the ultimate time frame to see this kind of transition happening. It's also an unusually abusive environment for a variety of reasons. I mean, when you go to college, you're in an environment where likely you were kind of that big fish in a small pond situation previously, and then you end up going to college and realizing just how many people have also accomplished a lot, and how smart so many other people are compared to what you had seen before. And that's a bit of a system shock to make that adjustment. College is also, beyond just being a new environment in general, which impacts us, it's entirely built on this idea of critique, of analysis, of grading, of proving. And when you're going through this kind of life transition from being dependent to being independent, and all you're getting is critiqued, that's going to have an impact on how you perceive your own worth. Also, we know higher education was not built for every student population. It was built for a very specific population a long time ago. And it's taking a long time to adapt it and adjust it and sometimes tear it down and rebuild it to be able to properly serve all student populations, or as many student populations as possible, because I don't think we're anywhere near serving all populations well. But college is also heavily credentialed, so it's intimidating. And for some students, degrees are quite literally a factor of survival. Their families have put immense pressure on them to succeed, and that the family's well-being is attached to this success of a student who has to finish college and be able to earn more, make more, help support them more. And it creates a lot of guilt, fear, and doubt that just is pervasive in everything that we do.
Tom, one of the things I hear loud and clear, and I've not thought of it this way before, is the idea of intimidating systems. I mean, when Patty and I have talked about, sort of the struggle in the AVP role, the idea that you're moving from something you're really comfortable with to kind of stepping a little bit out of your comfort zone. And then we all know that universities have some system of university hazing that you have to jump through certain intimidating hoops to sort of prove yourself, much like in college first gen. So it makes me think about the difference between being student ready versus our students college ready, the difference between being a champion for women leaders versus looking for the next AVP, and things like that. And so I wonder if people could speak to, if you think of it in that way, where the systems are just not created as maybe even safe systems to risk a little bit, or a system that's not necessarily pouring into you just yet. How do you think about your imposter syndrome then? How do you think about how you're doing now? If you think of it as a systems approach versus, I really am so frightful. I mean, I never thought of myself as afraid of things until you go through these transitions, and it is intimidating. I wonder what other people think about that.
I don't know if Jessica, Lane, or Patricia have any thoughts there.
Well, I guess I'll jump in a little bit. When I think about it, it's also thinking about who's the safe group that you surround yourself with, that you can be vulnerable and share some of that information with, and share some of those fears or scenarios where you're like, okay, I experienced this today, and this is how it made me feel, and this is what I thought of myself. And I think all of us kind of have those mentors that we can reach out to, but then it's also a matter of who's close by that you can have those candid conversations with, and that's important too. I think I might have heard someone else jump in, but I think it's important to be able to figure out where are those safe spaces that you can have those candid conversations, or figure out if they're not necessarily in your workplace, where might those be? And I think everyone has to navigate that for themselves.
Yeah, I think you've touched on a huge point there. In the workplace, when we talk about psychological safety, to be able to bring things up and discuss problems and be able to have conflicting ideas that are progressive and generative, that actually help us move things forward. But we don't always necessarily think of that about a college experience. Mentors and support groups, essentially, for lack of a better term, any type of cluster of group that you can get, where you can share your thoughts, your feelings about where you're at, what you're doing. All of that is beneficial to students. Just the act of sharing speaking about a problem lowers your stress levels associated with it. And then, of course, you also have access to those other minds in the room that can help you find different perspectives, different ways of reframing it, that can help also give you external evidence to say, no, you're not this way. No, I don't see you as that way. Getting that feedback from others is helpful. Oftentimes we'll dismiss it as luck, or we'll have a rationale for why we don't accept people's praise. But it's ultimately a great source of support to be able to help you work through issues. And mentors, as you mentioned, are also an amazing source of information. Not only can they help you navigate the kind of hidden curriculum of higher education, these hidden pathways and hidden structures that you kind of have to experience to understand how to get through, they can help also connect you with networks and resources, open doors that are not previously open, help tell you about ways to avoid painful experiences, so you don't have to go through it yourself. But as first gen students, imposter syndrome also comes up with this same idea of fear of failure, but also this pervasive sense of not asking for help, that you have to accomplish things on your own.
Well, I mean, speaking to that a little bit, I remember struggling and whatever. And I was like, this is my chosen pathway. Like I've chosen to go to college, and I want to, get the types of jobs that my mom and dad want me to get. And I was like, why isn't that coming easy to me? I mean, my mom and dad worked hard, and I saw them achieve beyond possibility, and so you start to think, well, why am I not doing that in college? I've chosen this. I should be good at it. I was good academically. And now here I am sort of in this environment where I don't know that I'm having to figure it out on my own. I didn't know that as a first year student, as a second year student. I knew that once I got connected to student support services. Oh, I didn't know that I didn't have to struggle. I could be networked or connected. The same is true of my profession. I really thought, I've been a good director. I should be a good AVP. I didn't know that there was a hidden curriculum to understand that you have to make a leap. There's a leap you make from being a director to an AVP, or from being an RLC to an assistant director, or whatever. I mean, those leaps, you kind of think, well, I got good in this, so I should be getting good in this. And it causes a lot of doubt.
Absolutely. Well, and like we said, we're surrounded by experts. You're surrounded by graduate students and faculty with amazing credentials and big job titles, and they're intimidating, regardless of whether we want them to be or not. Students are sometimes thoroughly afraid of even the slightest slight to a faculty member, for fear that it could reflect in their grade somehow. We've not built accessible structures that are helping students also do things like changing a major. For some, it's a very easy thing, but for a lot of people, that's the moment that you're admitting that you failed at something, that you weren't successful. That's the moment where you have to then tell your family that you're no longer going to be a doctor, or you're no longer going to be an engineer. That can be a massively transformative moment for them, the negative or positive. And, also, if you're not doing well in classes, being able to say that you're not learning a concept, being able to seek, academic support services and tutoring. Why do we think students have so many troubles accessing those services? Because we don't make it something that gets rid of the stigma of seeking help. And seeking help is something that's already hard enough. And seeking help that could be related to the thing that you think you're going to do in your life, that can have a lot of weight.
Yeah, a couple of things
Jessica
that
and Lane, if y'all want to jump in,
stood out to
love
me.
to hear from y'all.
One, I think a lot of times either college or in your career may be the first time like you feel like you've had some kind of like larger scale failure. And so I think that is the first time where people start to, you start to panic, and you feel like it's nobody else has experienced that you've done something wrong, or that, whatever it is over, and there's no hope. So I think that that's really hard to can be really hard to overcome. And when you were talking about, people like living up to the expectations of their family or those that they're close to, I saw that a lot when I was recruiting. You'd have students who, like, their parents expected them to be a doctor or an engineer, and they're like, that's just not that's not me, and seeing them have to work through that struggle of, do I follow through with my parents' hopes and wishes? Do I have a hard conversation? Do I just go for it and do what I want to do? So that was something I saw a lot, and tried to, think about how that related to myself. But the other thing, kind of unrelated, was that I was thinking about too, was for me, I've kind of felt the imposter syndrome more so as I'm like getting in, continuing in my career. And I think one of the things is it's, in college, and I know it's different for everybody, but I felt like there were kind of some defined next steps and defined resources that were there for you to support you. And especially like you kind of knew what your next step was, and a decent timeline of when that was going to happen. And then you get into your career and you're like, okay, like it's not just you do something for one year or 5 years and automatically move to the next step. That it's, you're having to work through that, and what does that look like? And it may start to look drastically different than, the person you started to work with at the same time. And just overcoming that imposter syndrome can be challenging, and understanding kind of what your next step is. So those are just some things that are on my mind as y'all been talking.
Yeah, thanks,
I'm
Lynn.
glad you mentioned those things too, because I think about early career me, and a failure at work was going to be catastrophic. You had to survive. You've got student loans to pay off. You have, you're coming out of low income environment. You're trying to create yourself a stable future, and you're barely able to pay bills. Higher ed salary is not exactly the most robust. So you're not sitting in an environment where you feel entirely stable or comfortable, and then to have the work pressures of trying to succeed, and also that others may be reliant upon that success. You talk about, Patricia's got the sign above that say students are the purpose of our work, which I love. And that also brings amongst its own stressor, the idea that we're here to help support and serve others, and if we don't do it right, we could hurt somebody, we could damage how somebody progresses in their own life. That's a lot of stress and pressure that gets put upon us. The other thing that you touched on, Lane, was my other favorite topic, which is family. Family put all sorts of pressures on us. Sometimes there's expectations that you achieve more than them. Sometimes you have, family who don't have any concept of higher education, especially as first gen. I found a lot, my students were having trouble translating between two worlds. They're trying to translate to the world of their family, and they're trying to translate the higher education world. And you're trying to do that while you're still trying to learn what the higher education world actually even looks like. So you don't have a good idea of what it looks like. You're barely just starting with it and experiencing it. And here you are having to fight off, your frustrating aunt or uncle at a family function who's talking to you about how you need to go pick up this landscaper gig because it's going to be better for you. Like, what are you supposed to do with that? How are you supposed to translate to them that you're putting in this investment to get something larger long term, and they don't have any understanding of what that's like or why it would be like that. They don't understand why you have to put in the hours you have to put in. Oh, you were at class already. Classes are only like 15, 16 hours a week. What do you mean you have more work? Homework and reading and studying and researching. If it's not blocked out on your calendar as a class that you have to attend, then you're done. Trying to figure that out. A lot of my students had expectations that they picked up additional jobs, multiple additional jobs in many cases, because they weren't in class. If you weren't in class, then you had to work. So then when are they studying? When are they researching? When are they getting involved in campus activities or high impact practices that we know have massive implications for students into their careers? You're not learning the higher ed system by just going to class.
Yeah. And I liked Lane's example about the first time you fail big at work. I mean, it feels high stakes, even though we're often in environments where people are saying we learn from our failures, but that's not what's really being communicated. What's really being communicated is you might fail and you might learn from it, but it was big that you failed. And it's not going to, we expect not just for you to learn from your mistake, but to never make a mistake again. And that is so pervasive, I think, in the culture of higher ed, which I think, Tom, to your point, makes sort of the stakes high and the imposter syndrome high at the same time,
One of the things that I always like to do to frame things for folks is to think about, are you a perfectionist or are you a procrastinator? So, Mary, which one are you?
I can be a little bit of both.
Okay, so
Patty knows there's a project right now that there was a big procrastination. It wasn't procrastination. I'd like to say that it was more, I'm talking about Blazers at Birmingham. It was more of getting the right people, and that's where my perfectionism kicks in. I didn't have the right people. I needed to get the perfect right people at the table. Until we got that, we couldn't move forward. And so it seemed like procrastination, but it was perfectionism. And I hate that. I mean, it is a part of me, so I do try to embrace it and make the most of it. And I think that's where, too, I get very inspired by others who can do that as well, because then you feel like part of the group. Like, this isn't abnormal to feel this way and to still move forward.
Lane, are you a
little bit of
perfectionist or a procrastinator?
which can be a hard combo.
I think this is a trick question.
Yeah, it's a trick question. I was going to go back to before as far as there being high stakes. And I think when we think, especially right now, about the landscape of higher education and how much higher education is being scrutinized, and the value of degrees being scrutinized and the funding for higher education being scrutinized, it feels like the stakes have gotten even higher than what they used to be. I would say when we first got into the field. So I think that's also playing into questioning ourselves even more to ensure that we're proving ourselves to whoever might be questioning higher education, as you think about institutions closing or governments questioning the work that we're doing specifically within student affairs, it does feel like the stakes are higher. And so I do think that we tend to question ourselves more because of that.
Yeah, it does add a lot of extra stress. I've only seen that scrutiny increase my entire career. It definitely has gotten kind of progressively higher, but I've absolutely seen the exact same, and that we haven't figured out how to answer some critical questions, and we haven't figured out how to put in some critical supports from the beginning, from all levels of education, not just higher ed. And I'm not doing the whole pass the buck to K-12 kind of thing. But we do a crappy job of helping people figure out what it is they're going to do with their lives in this country. We just don't help people figure that out well. If you look at most institutions, you'll have mandatory advising appointments. Do you have a mandatory career counseling appointment? When do you have to sit down with someone to figure out what it is you're going to do with your life? If college is meant to focus on those life goals, those career goals, advising is often the one that they look to for a lot of that work. But at the same time, how are you doing that in an advising session? I looked up our statistics here in California, and we're the 5th worst in the nation for high school counselors to students. Our ratio is something like 615 students per counselor. How in the world is a high school student knowing if they're even needing to go to college for a career, much less if there's other options for them?
Yeah.
So we're sticking with friends, we're sticking with family, we're sticking with popular media to tell us what it is we need to do. There's so many disciplines in college that you can study that are brand new that you'll never have been exposed to. But most people are thinking about engineering, business, medical school. They'll know they need to take a psychology class because you take psychology in college. And that's it. Like the depth and breadth of it is not there. And so if you're trying to expose yourself to new ideas, having that uncertainty, that uncomfortable feeling about what it is you're going to do with yourselves is very much a challenge. And we don't do a good job in higher education of talking about the public good that is generated from all of it, and the good works that are being done to help people. I had mentioned before this whole idea of a perfectionist versus procrastinator. I'm a procrastinator, definitely 100%. But the way I always describe it is a perfectionist. If you think about it, you have a task that you have to achieve, but you're full of doubts. So your doubt leads to overwork. You overdo everything. You do 100 different versions of it. You rework it. You're constantly going and going and going. You feel like you're kind of on this treadmill, but you're not really getting anywhere. And you're working your butt off. And then you would finally finish your thing, and people give you praise, but you don't accept it. And the reason you don't accept it is, one, you feel like you're worried that you're only going to be successful when you overwork, when you overdo something, that you're only good enough when you have worked like crazy. That normal amount of work is not going to work for you, that you're not good enough to just be normal. And then you're ultimately afraid of the next task because you beat yourself up and you're exhausted. Now, my procrastinators are in a different boat. We avoid everything and do everything else except the task that we need to do because, again, of self-doubt and worry. And we get no momentum. We avoid the task. We do everything else. We rush through it. We're successful. We're not going to accept that praise and internalize that praise if it's successful because it was luck. We barely got it through. We barely got there. It's not our best work. You're ultimately afraid that the next time you do it, you're not going to be able to meet your deadline. And you're not going to be able to get the thing done. So I usually frame it that way. When I give my presentation to students, my presentations are all in Lego. As you can probably see, there's some Lego stuff going on behind me. And so the one about procrastinator is from the Lego movie, and Lego Emmett, who's like running around just building something at random on the fly. And my perfectionist is President Business, who's walking around, gluing items together because they have to be perfect in exactly the right way. But I use that as kind of a way to help students realize where they can go and what they're doing. And a lot of it is just helping them put a name on it. So I know in the last few minutes, one of the things I wanted to make sure to mention is, some of the things that you can do to kind of help address it for ourselves and help address it for others. First thing you do is name it. Understanding imposter phenomenon, imposter syndrome, understanding that name is also crap. That name is something that was just thrown out there in the 1970s, but that other psychologists were throwing out, inferiority complex in the 1920s. It's all just a way of trying to comprehend the feelings that we're going through as we're making these transitions and are having these experiences. But naming also gives us a sense of control, helps us understand it more, and help fear it less. And then the big one that we talked about earlier with first gen is, trying to ask for help, pushing us forward to kind of get that extra assistance. Often we're trying to do things on our own as kind of a personal badge of honor to thrive, or we're used to getting no support and having to do it on our own because the system wasn't built for us. That means vulnerability, and vulnerability can sometimes be more than we're willing to give. We don't want to put ourselves out there because we have very little to give up. Talking about it, I think Patricia had talked about mentors and groups of other people as being your support network, and having mentors to help give you information, and that all helps lower your stress levels and give you access to networks. But some of the other things that you can do, and some of the things that I love to do, there's both visualizations and journaling. Visualizations are kind of when you just sit back and think about a scenario, and I like the one of the me of the past. So think about something that challenged you, say 5-10 years ago, 2 or 3 years ago. Think about something that really just racked you really hard, and think about what you would do today based on your new experience, based on this new information that you now have, based on the you as you are today. How would you handle it? Would it still give you the same level of stress? Would it still hit the same way? Would the me of the past have the same challenges as the me of now? And so that's a great way of looking at it, to also to remind yourself of how much you've grown and how much you've learned in the process. There's exercises you can do about over worrying and overworking, where you visualize giving yourself a limited time period or a limited number of tasks, or say references to go research, or whatever it is. You limit yourself so that way you don't overdo things. And oftentimes you talk about thinking about how you feel and limiting yourself to only doing a certain number of things. If you're a perfectionist, give yourself half the amount of time you normally allow yourself to work on a project. How does that make you feel? Does that stress you out? What does it feel like to turn something in? Yeah. And so then thinking about, well, why? Like, what benefit was coming from doing all that extra work? Sometimes if you have a lower stakes thing, you can use it as a test case scenario and try to do half the amount that you normally would do on something and turn that in and see if there's any different reaction. And then the other is just thinking about the guilt over success, visualizing yourself in the future successful. What does it look like? Who's there to support you? Who's your naysayers? Who's giving you mixed messages? What were the supports that you needed in order to be successful? Kind of help project for the future. The other portion is journaling and documenting. You can definitely, like any Fitbit or any other personal tracker, they help you visualize where you've come from and where you're going, see that growth over time. One of the most popular ones is a praise journal, that you document positive comments that others give you, and then both your internal and external reactions. So how did you feel about their praise? How did you internalize the praise? Or did you internalize the praise? Did you dismiss the praise? Did you dismiss it internally, but then thank them externally?
Yes.
So it's a question of how did you do it? Why did you do it? Oftentimes it gives you an opportunity to give thanks back to the person for giving you the praise, which then encourages more praise, and that's a wonderful thing. We all could use more of that. But there's also things we can do for other people as well. Take people's doubts seriously, encourage them to talk, encourage them to seek help, listen, ask clarifying questions. Anytime you can ask people to be specific, to give details. I used to talk about that with resume writing. I used to say more details equals less BS. So basically saying, give me more, because the more details you give me, the more rich it is, the more I can experience it myself, the more I can put myself in that mindset and see what it is you're doing. Asking for specifics, asking for details, and being specific and detailed with your own praise. The more specific and detailed you can be with it, the more people are going to go, oh, those are the things that I need to keep doing. Be honest and find activities to help them relax, because we all can use a little bit of that. So, but definitely don't discount their feelings. Don't hold them accountable for the speed at which they change. Some of us change very quickly. Some of us change very slowly. Some things about us can change on a drop of a dime. Other things can take decades. It just depends on who you are and your experiences, your personal traumas, your family, your history, your environment, your resources, your motivation. It all is a part of that. The other thing I like to always tell people too is, remember, perfection isn't real. Nothing is perfect. Everything changes. So you don't have to be perfect.
Perfection is not real. That is true. Okay, thank you, Tom.
Yeah.
I felt like this was a college course on imposter syndrome, and I have some notes, and I hope that you all have gleaned some little gem from what Tom was saying. I'm wondering if we can't just go around, just to say, what's the one or two things that you heard tonight that might be a little different about imposter syndrome that maybe you haven't heard before, or that you've heard in a new way tonight?
Well, I'll jump in. One of the things that, as I was going through my doctoral coursework, that I used as a mantra for me, that this conversation just brought back to me again, was practical persistence, not perfection. And that was, this whole conversation just brought that back, and I was like, that's what I need to put as a sticky note on my computer, so I read it each and every morning and just remind myself that that's what I'm going for. I'm going to just be better than I was yesterday.
I think for me, it's just like
perfect.
Getting it back on my mind that,
I like that,
a lot of times it's easy to see like the successes in other people, and it's like, of course they were successful because they did this or they did that. And it's so hard a lot of times to see that in ourselves and to praise ourselves for that. So I think just having that back on my mind that like not everything was just luck. Like maybe some things along the way were, but not everything was just luck. That you got to, like, I got to where I am. Like I did things to get to where I am. And yes, I'm very thankful for people and circumstances along the way that helped make that happen. But also, like that, I have to like remember that I was a part of it too. So to not just see things in other people, but to also like make sure I'm realizing that within myself.
Malcolm Gladwell would agree with you, Lane Chapman. Effort is the big thing. So, Jessica, I don't know if you're still with us or if you can unmute if you wanted to say anything.
Yeah, I'm still here. I don't know exactly like one thing to point out. I liked everything that y'all have discussed today. I can relate to a lot of it. I'm new in my career field. I just graduated, and so I'm seeing the difference from being an undergrad student to even in my profession within higher ed. Although it's completely different. And then I went to graduate school, and then that was entirely different from undergrad. So it's just kind of seeing, I guess, all that and kind of what y'all are saying, it makes sense now. It's something I've been reflecting on since starting this position. like a month ago. And so it totally makes sense now.
Thank you. What? Go ahead, Tom.
I'm putting a couple of quick links in there. One is I put a Gmail or a Google Drive link to one of my presentations that I would do on Lego to my students on imposter syndrome. I've also put a link to my LinkedIn, so anytime you want to connect, happy to do so. I think what Lane was describing is what psychologists would call cognitive dissonance. That's that idea of unease, feelings of unease, and an attempt to relieve discomfort by explaining things away. And so we often are far more willing to be harsh about the internal, about our own impacts, and harsher about ourselves and less harsh about the environment. But if you look at things like burnout, if you look at the top 10 reasons why people are burned out, it's like 9 of the 10 are the environment.
Yes.
Not the individuals. And so know that it's far easier to say it's your fault than to think about how a system could be at fault.
That's right. And I think that was my takeaway, is the idea that I used to think of myself as I am intimidated, but the real thing is this is intimidating. Like, this is an intimidating environment. And so I think that was my biggest takeaway. Tom, thank you so much for joining us and having this discussion. And Patty, thank you for that. I'm going to write that down. I think that's a mantra for me too. And so I want to remind everybody that we have another first gen professionals as influencers spot on August the 10th, I think at 5:00 Central Standard Time. And we're going to be having James Winfield, who's actually from Birmingham, Alabama. But he is, I forget, it's gone out of my head where he's working right now, but he's working in first gen work and doing the good work. And his topic is going to be on social capital as a first gen professional, which I think fits in nicely to some of the things that we've talked about in this series, and especially thinking about imposter syndrome and thinking, how can you be an influence to make sure that people, or that you even start with yourself, some of those things that we talked to tonight. Tom, very practical strategies that you gave. I wrote them all down. I'm like, I'm trying 5 of these tonight. So if you could hang on, Tom, just for a minute after everybody leaves. Thank you all for joining us.